Mading va au hula dunya, she Lillian ahora. Hamia furak aun in Auckland, she mbala sho moyahi. Good morning, Morena, in my own native, my ancestral, language of Scottish Gaelic. A gift of a language, a gift of a desire to greet you in that language has developed from my learning the Māori language. Well, with a spirit of expectation, could we please welcome Matua Alistair Reese.
Kia ora, Lillian. First of all, a sound check. Can you hear me at the back there? That's a nod. Is that a yes? Yeah, okay. Ka pai, thank you. First of all, to the organising committee, thank you so much for the invitation into the unknown this morning and for the risk that you've taken in inviting me, not really knowing who I am or what it is I'm about to deliver. My two children, Naomi and Sean, went to Puke High School, and it was quite instrumental in shaping who they are today. I want to acknowledge especially one of the teachers, Brian Bushell, who was profoundly influential in shaping my son's life, who in the outdoors, my son ended up dying in an avalanche in the South Island, but he died carrying a passion in his heart that had been formed by Brian. And I just want to acknowledge the teachers in our midst here who have that capacity to input into people's children's lives. Sorry about this. So, yeah, thank you for that, for all the teachers here that give themselves into the lives of the students. He nore ke te atua, mā ngā rongo ki te whenua whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Glory to God, peace on earth and goodwill to you all. Ke huri atu ki ngā rārangi maunga o tēnei rohi. So I turn to the various maunga of this rohi. Me te hongo ore e noho nei I waiganui I ngā pito o ēnei maunga. And to the living who live in the midst of these maunga, ko rangiuru te maunga, ko otawa te maunga. Ki te arawa, ko tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. So I acknowledge the mountains among whom we dwell, Rangiuru and Otawa. Ki tapuika nui a tia, ki wataha nui a hei, ko tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Ka huri atu ki ngā mata waka I waganui e a tātou, so the different waka that are amongst us this morning. This is my greeting to you. Ki ngā tangata tiriti hoki, ngā haue whā, me ngā tauira tāwhito o te Puke High School, and to the elder students of Te Puke High School, ke te mihi, ke te mihi, ke te mihi. So I'm greeting you all hopefully this morning, and it is indeed a real privilege to be amongst you. I was born in the Waikato, but about 40 years ago I saw the light and we moved to the banks of the Kaituna, and we've been farming on the banks of the Kaituna for the last 40 odd years. And about I guess about 20 years ago, let's see if we can get this going. About 20 years ago, I changed from being a hands-on dairy farmer to an absentee kiwi fruit orchardist. And it was quite fortuitous in the sense that that enabled me to go back to school and to learn some of the things that Lillian was referring to, the things that I didn't learn when I was at school. And that led me on a bit of a journey, really, over the last 20 odd years. And one of the things I did was I did some research around Tauranga, Te Papa Peninsula, and some of the land exchanges that took place there, and it had quite a profound impact upon me personally. And I felt if I and my people could hear some of the stories of our land, I thought maybe we would actually have a different view of things. So I was really intrigued by the village of Manaweka, and so by the invitation of one of my friends, Hene Pōtene, I began and I did this thesis around Manaweka, trying to understand something of the nature of how that village became what that village is. So this, in a sense, this kōrero, this talk this morning comes out of that thesis, but brings us into a little bit of the present. And I understand that it's probably maybe quite an uncomfortable talk for some of us this morning, and I know that some of you have already experienced some discomfort over this last couple of days, and so in some ways I apologise for that. I'm just an innocent bystander who's been invited to share some stories, so please don't shoot the messenger. I'm very happy to be corrected on anything that I'm sharing. I'm a learner, like many of us, and still seeking to understand not only the stories but the outcome of the stories. So, sorry, I'm trying to juggle a bit of, yeah. So my plan today is really to acknowledge the whenua here, the whenua on which the high school is standing, and in a way to drill down into the story of this particular land here on which we stand. I'm reminded, my wife Jeannie, who is in the second row here, she's from Canada. That's her with the beautiful white-grey hair there. Not grey, it's sort of white. And there were some stories that come out of where she comes from in Canada. The First Nation people in British Columbia were having some issues with the Crown, and the Crown were laying some claim to some land. And one of the elders of that tribe stood and said to the Crown, "If this is your land, where are your stories?" So, and out of that they proceeded to tell millennia of their stories in the land, and it really put into context something of the Crown's claims. And so this is, I guess, my challenge to myself is, if this is my land, where are my stories, or where are our stories, and what do our stories sound like? So because we're on this particular whenua here, this is the focus of what I will be looking at, is this area called Te Moana a Toi, or the Ocean of Toi, which is now called by many of us the Bay of Plenty. So that'll be the kind of the mid-focus. I will go further, and I will look also at the wider stories, and I will drill down and end up into this particular piece of whenua, this particular piece of land as well. This is stories that have been handed to me. And I know that different people will have different versions of this story, different versions of this whenua. I'm not wanting to claim that what I'm sharing with you is the definitive story. It's a story that comes through my lens and has been filtered through my eyes and my experience, and as I said, has been given to me by others. So if we step back in time and we look at some of the settlements of the land on which we are now seated, there's a group of people called Ngāti Oho Mairangi, who lived in a place called Raiatia. And at a period of time, because of the conditions of what was happening in that place, a migration was undertaken. The name of that waka was called Oho Mairangi. The captain of that waka was called Tamati Kapua. Tamati Kapua was quite an astute leader and a little bit tricky, we might say. He had on board a man called Ngāti Roirangi, who was his navigator. Tamati Kapua had eyes for Ngāti wife. So in the middle of that voyage, one of the stories goes that they encountered te korokoro or te parata, a whirlpool. They were in deep trouble. One of the versions of the story is that a shark showed up and helped them to escape from that crisis and actually escorted the waka down to Aotearoa. A name for that shark is Te Arawa. So there was a change in the name, as I understand it, from Ohomairangi to Te Arawa. So the people of Te Arawa came down here into the Bay of Plenty, and there were two very important people for our story, a man called Hei and a man called Tia. And Hei stood in the sight of land and he says, Te takapū o takatama, waitaha nui a Hei. Tia, the twin brother, also stood and he said, Te takapū o takatama, tapuika nui a Tia. They were claiming the land in sight by their naming. And so these two brothers and their offspring have settled upon the land upon which we dwell. I cannot tell the full story of this land in one session, and though I am choosing to look at it through one particular lens, and there will be some opposition to the lens I have chosen, I am sure, but because of my experience and partly because of the whenua on which we stand, it will be mainly a Waitaha lens in which I will be telling the beginnings of this story. So, Waitaha Nui Hei settled into this area. One of the kaumātua in terms of the land claims in the 1880s, his name was Hakarai Tipene, said Waiari is the dividing stream, and Waitaha's land continues along that stream, and Tapawika the same on the opposite side of the stream. So one simplistic, I guess, way of describing how that land falls, you could say that the Waiari is one of the simple markers that, although it's complicated, is that Tapuika is on the southern eastern side and Waitaha on the western side where we are. But in my understanding, those two brothers and those two iwi hapu are integrally related. And so those are the first settlers that came into this area. Of course, there were some other settlers that came later. One of the important ones from a European point of view was Abel Tasman, who came here in 1642. I would suggest that immediately on his arrival there was a cultural clash. And the outworkings of his visit into the South Island was death. And he left New Zealand calling the particular area where he had encountered Te Iwi Māori, he called it Murderer's Bay, as he had lost some of his people. Te Iwi Māori had lost some of their people as well. Unfortunately, this encounter between Europeans and Māori didn't get off to a very propitious start. The next encounter was the very famous navigator James Cook. He made 3 visits here originally. His first encounter in Turanganui Kiwa in Gisborne also resulted in a death. I sense also that there was a cultural clash that took place in the way that these people encountered each other, and the misreading perhaps of the greetings, the misreadings of the pohiri ended up with the loss of life. Of course, Cook sailed past this area and he changed its name from Te Moana Atoi to the Bay of Plenty. He also sailed past an island up the coast here, which was called Toitū. He changed its name to Mare Island. The inspiration for his changing of the name was the day that he sailed past it was the Lord Mayor's birthday in London. He thought it would be appropriate to actually acknowledge that by the renaming of Toitū. The naming of places actually has significance. The naming of places carries with it something of the impetus of dwelling, of ownership, of mana over places. And that's one of the things that Puke was doing, was he was coming through here and, in a sense, establishing his own presence, or establishing the presence of his queen or his king at the time of his voyages through here. We had Tasman, who went back to Europe. They changed the name to New Sea Land, New Zealand. So that was their New Sea Land. And of course, that's the name that first of all gathered the momentum in Europe when the stories went back there about this land in the Antipodes that had been discovered. Tasman, Cook, went back to Europe. The news spread about this extraordinary place in the South Seas that was an abundant land full of so much riches in its natural resources. And so we had a group of people who were sealers and the whalers and the ones who were coming for timber. And they came down here and they engaged with Māori, sometimes in a positive way and sometimes in a negative way, but they were taking the resources from here and back to Europe and to North America. I call that a kind of a de facto relationship that was established in that time. The other ones who were, I think, quite instrumental, and this is the lens that I look through, but the missionaries who played a very influential role in the early formation of our identity as a people. But probably one of the most significant things that happened with the arrival of these sealers, whalers, missionaries and others was the arrival of new technologies. Māori engaged with modernity. And as a result of that, we have the arrival of the muskets. I acknowledge the muskets because I feel with the coming of this new technology that something significant shifted within Te Ao Māori. Something significant shifted. I call it what happened as an outcome of that, what historians call the musket wars. I call that technologically enhanced utu. So the new technology engaged or slotted in with the tikanga of the day, but it actually threw the tikanga into in a sense, a real spin. Because what seemed to be serving well in hand-to-hand combat earlier on in an utu situation, when the muskets came, it actually brought an extraordinary carnage. And historians tell us that about 20,000 people were killed as a result of the musket wars that started off obviously up with Ngāpuhi and coming down through the Motu and came down into this area. And there's a little story that I'll tell soon about this musket war and the engagement of Ngāpuhi with this area that was very significant for what happened later on. So the musket wars, and during that time, the Church Missionary Society, the missioners engaged in this area. A man called Henry Williams Karuwha, who was the translator of the Treaty of Waitangi. He came down here, first of all, in 1826. And this is one of my favourite paintings or engravings of our colonial history. This is an engraving that was done by Henry Williams himself. And you can see his yacht there. It's called Te Karere, which means the news, the news. And he had been invited by Titori, one of the Ngāpuhi chiefs, to sail down from the north on one of their musket utu or muru haerenga. And so here he is in Tauranga Harbour, this picture here of Henry Williams sailing in the midst of the Wakataua. And his journal is very fascinating as he engages as they're coming down the coastline with Titori and others and saying, hey, there's got to be another way. And so the mission station was set up in Tauranga Moana, and with that mission station began to be signalled what we called this new tide of immigration. There were two main European settlements or centres of activity, you could say, in our area. That would be firstly Makatū, and that was where the very famous Philip Tapsell was stationed, or notorious Philip Tapsell, or however you want to describe this extraordinary man. And the other one was in Tauranga itself, where the Church Missionary Society was established on Te Papa. Te Papa is the peninsula of land on which Tauranga city sits at present. So this immigration started to explode within New Zealand. And here I have an example of an advertisement. The advertisements were hyperbolic in the United Kingdom. The hyperbolic in the sense that there was an invitation to the landless. There was an invitation to the poor, like my ancestor Alexander Reese, who came here from Glasgow in 1867 as an impoverished, landless young man of 17 years old who had been in a factory, steel factory, from the time he was 11, without a hope. And so these advertisements in the newspapers over there put out this advertisement to say, come, haere mai, yeah, there's land as far as the eye can see, and it's all up for the grabs. That's essentially the type of, the tenor of the invitation to the Europeans like my ancestors to come out here. The other thing that was happening when these settlers came was what I term an anarchy. So because they were not under the law of their own crown, they came into the new land and they had a disrespect also for the LORE of this land. So it was kind of like a modern equivalent of drug, sex and rock and roll in the 19th century, where drunkenness and syphilis and that were coming out because of the quality of some of the settlers that were coming into the land. That was, I guess, some of the pre-configuration, the context that led to He Whakaputanga, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which incidentally will be commemorated next week on the 28th of October. And also what led from the establishment of that, and the British resident went to the signing or the formation of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. A treaty that was signed also in Tauranga Moana. I think it's important for the tenor of our talk today to get at least some understanding of what was the nature of that treaty, the Tiriti o Waitangi, that was signed in 1840. And of course, time precludes going into detail, but I want to just spend a couple of minutes on two aspects of it that I think need to sit with us. The first thing was the instructions that Lord Normanby, who was the head of the Colonial Office, gave to Hobson when he said, write the treaty. But here's the ethos of the treaty that I want you to write. He said, all dealings with the natives for their lands must be conducted on principles of sincerity, justice, and good faith. Nor is this all. they must not be permitted to enter into any contracts in which they might be ignorant and unintentional authors of injuries to themselves. So he's saying, I want you to create a treaty by, under no circumstances are Māori to enter into if they are to be disadvantaged in any way, particularly in terms of their land. So it was out of this proclamation that Hobson wrote the treaty, as it were, on the back of an envelope in very quick time. Again, I'm just going to highlight an aspect of the treaty because it pertains to what we're talking about this morning. Article the 2nd. Her Majesty the Queen of England confirms and guarantees to the chiefs and tribes of New Zealand and to the respective families and individuals thereof the full and exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands and estates, etamia etamia. So there's a very strong component of the treaty which guarantees to iwi Māori a protection on their lands. And the second part of that is that the Crown was given and sought preemption for the purchase of their lands. So that meant that prior to that, Māori were engaging just with Joe Soap and Jack Smith and et cetera, for the purchase of their lands, and all kinds of stuff was going on, and the Crown said, let's stop that and let's all the dealings go through us from now on. Now that had some positive and some negative aspect to it, but essentially what the Crown was doing is it was seeking in the first instance to protect the land dealings that took place post 1840. I think in another thing that's really helpful in seeking to understand our context and where we've arrived is looking at the New Zealand population. In 1840, at the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, there were 2,000 European settlers. And demographers guess that there were around 100,000 Māori at that time. Progressively, as you can see the numbers on the slide there, the balance changed. As more and more settlers came into the land, the different things of disease, poverty, land loss meant that the numbers of Māori went down. And so many issues arose after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. It was a high point in some sense in terms of this cultural encounter. There was an agreement that took place on the ground that I believe was full of hope and full of optimism. But of course, reality didn't take long to set in. And the population increase was one of those things, this massive increase in population. I didn't hear many stories about our land when I was growing up. My dad told me a few. Most of the things I heard about was Norman the Conqueror, 1066, the Magna Carta, 1215, Battle of Waterloo, that was Battle of Trafalgar was 1812, Battle of Waterloo was 1820, is that right? Something like that anyway. See, these things sit. Since I was 10 years old, those dates sit here. But I didn't know very much about, I never learned anything about the treaty, but my dad told me the story about Honeheke and the cutting down of the flagpole in Ruapekapeka. But I had no understanding why. I just heard it was just a bit of wanton vandalism. I never understood that the flag that at the top was the ensign, and Heke was actually it was saying something has gone wrong with our treaty when this Mai Tino Rangatiratanga actually has been exchanged for something else. It was symbolic of the issues that were beginning to emerge after 1840 when Te Iwi Māori was saying this treaty that we signed perhaps is not affording us the type of protection that we assumed that it would. So there were many issues that began. So the issue of the land, the issue of sovereignty, we get the rise of the king movement, the kingitanga, the coronation of Potatouta Wherewhero in 1858. And what happened also, an unfortunate side issue was in Te Iwi Māori there became division because different hapu iwi had to cope and strategize with how are we to best position ourselves in this new reality. And so not only did it bring division between Māori and Pākehā, but it also brought division between different hapu, different whānau, and this is one of the things that we will see when we drill down here into New Zealand, into our Te Puke story. So moving along, this Kāwanatanga established itself in 1856 and began to enact certain laws that became very detrimental to iwi Māori. In my view, we talk about confiscation and other things, but I think these land legislations are probably some of the most destructive legislations that, in terms of the context of their impact upon te iwi Māori. One of the most important was the 1862 Native Lands Act. And I'm not going to bore you with all this legislation, but essentially what the Native Lands Act that was brought in 1862 was, it actually changed the tikanga, or the whole ways that land ownership was organised, and it was changed to a European style. We call the individualisation of title. So from a society that had a communitarian view of kaitiakitanga, or dwelling, were forced into a position of saying, this is our land and I have mana over it. The Minister of Justice at the time said the Native Land Act was to bring the great bulk of the lands within the reach of colonisation, and the detribalisation of the Māori to destroy the principle of communism upon which their social system is based, and which stands as a barrier in the way of all attempts to amalgamate the Māori race into our social and political system. So you can see there was a strategy behind these legislations that was really to bring New Zealand as a whole under a European umbrella. And I'm not here to really argue the merits of communitarianism or individual titles per se. This is the reality of but what took place. And so these courts, land courts, were established around the different parts of the motu. And Māori had to go to these courts and to present to the court an explanation of why they have ownership for a particular piece of land. One of the things of the early legislation was that was restricted to 10 people as well to be on the title. But Māori, like the Europeans, had a whole different system in terms of how land was deemed to be owned. And so I've listed these here. And so what the land court had to do, and they had some advisors from Te Ao Māori in the first instance, but they became a bit perfunctory later on, is that these courts had to adjudicate in terms of a tikanga who had mana. Who were the mana whenua over the pieces of land? And so this was a very complex process that took a long time. And Māori ended up coming into the towns, spending hours, weeks, and sometimes months in the cities where they were having to go to court and to outlay their claim of ownership on a piece of land that they had been sitting and living on mai rano for generations. And what the cost was enormous, both economically and socially. This is a group of Māori sitting outside a shop in Wanganui. They ended up running up large bills in order to be able, as they became involved in the cash economy and they became involved in paying advisors, legal bills, etc., etc. So they had to find their own way of financing this whole process. The other thing was, with the establishment of the new crown or the new government in New Zealand, England was saying, hey, you're on your own now. We're not going to pay for you. You need to pay for yourselves. You need to find funds. And one of the ways that those funds were generated was, again, through the New Zealand Settlements Act, or what they called confiscation or Raupatu. And Raupatu was instigated by the Crown against any Māori who was seen to be in rebellion against the activities of the Crown at the time. Te pūtake o te rere. In tomorrow, actually, at Gate Pa, there will be a big commemoration about the Battle of Gate Pa, but it's called Te Pūtake o te Rere, the source of the anger, and Tauranga is actually hosting that. Its day of commemoration is the 28th of October, but because it's Monday and it's there, so anyone is free to go and be a part of that. Taranaki, Waikato, Bay of Plenty, the land wars. The thirst for the land meant an eruption ultimately in war. The British Crown, the New Zealand government began to send the troops in to the various places to quell the rebellion of the various people who resisted. And so we have in our local area Gate Pa, Te Ranga, Te Weranga, the Bush campaign, which I'll talk a bit more about, which is one of the more under-emphasised areas of this encounter, happened between 1864 and 1867. Grey sent his troops in to Tauranga, and as a result of that, these encounters took place. I want to briefly talk about a significant personage in this kōrero, and you're doing well. I've probably only got another 15 minutes to go, if you can stick with me. His name is Hakaraia Mahika, or Old Hakaraia. Hakaraia whakapapas both into Tapuika and into Waitaha. He was a young rangatira here who ended up being captured by Ngāpuhi in 1820 on Mawao. He was taken back up to Ngāpuhi territory, and as a result of that, he encountered the Church Missionary Society up there, and he was educated within a church setting. He ended up becoming a Christian, and at a certain point of time, along with many other of the slaves, as they were called, he was released, and he came down, and he supported the mission work at Tangai. A man called Thomas Chapman, who was the missionary there. He spent many years as a teacher at Tangai in that mission station. And then at a period of time, he moved and he came and set up a new kāinga. And the kāinga was at a place called Kenana, or Canaan's Landing. And many of you who go through Waitangi on the way to Paengaroa, you will go past Kenana. And so he set up what's called a Christian village there, a bit like the village that was set up at Perea and other places. So he set that place up there, and then he faced a dilemma with the arrival of the Crown troops in Tauranga. To cut the story short, he ended up saying, I can't abide this, I will go, and he fought at Gate Pa. He fought also at Te Ranga, and he was one of the few rangatira that actually survived those two battles, because many died, particularly at Te Ranga. He ended up escaping from Te Ranga, and then with a group of followers, he was encamped around the Kaimai and the Mamaku, and was involved very much in what we call the Bush campaign, or Te Weranga. The Bush campaign was a final resistance of local Tauranga extension Māori, particularly who many of them had given their adherence to a religion called Hauhau or Paimārere. And so he engaged with that, and he was hunted along with many of them along the back of this range along here. And it was called a scorched earth campaign when the Crown troops, together with some of the Te Arawa flying column, who were involved in hunting him down and hunting others by burning the crops, burning the whare, and eventually causing him to escape into the Waikato and joining a very famous man called Te Kote, who he became, in a sense, a follower of. He was denounced as being the son of Satan. And the reason I'm going into this detail is because he becomes a very influential figure in the way that the Crown dealt with Waitaha and Tapuika in their Crown settlements. This son of Satan was eventually hunted down in the Waiaweka Gorge, and he was shot there along with several others. Again, I want to say that it caused division amongst whānau, hapu and iwi. And not all of Te Arawa were followers of Hakaraia. Not all were followers of the Kingitanga. And some were called Queenites, and some were called the Kingites. So this division was happening in the midst of. The Land Settlement Act, the land courts, etc., ended up essentially with these maps. I want to show you 4 maps. The first one is the North Island in 1860, after 20 years after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. That in white is land that is held by Māori. In 1890, so that's 50 years later, you see the land that is under Māori control. Right down to 100 years after the signing of Te Tiriti of Waitangi, you see the North Island. That's the land that is deemed to be under the direct control of Māori. In the South Island, it was all over bar the shouting within a very short time. For very complex reasons, most of the land was changed in terms of its control, its ownership, etc. The key thing being, of course, that whatever the reasons for it, Article 2 of the treaty said that their land shall be protected. So what happened here locally as a part of that raupatu, as a part of that confiscation, again, just some very broad detail. You can see the Waitaha boundary, of which I've got this red here, is they were, because of their involvement in supporting of the Kingitanga movement, because of their support let's see if I get, oh no, here we go. Yeah, because of their support of Hakaraia, it was established that Hakaraia was a rebel, and it is right a portion of the land of his hapu should be taken in payment for his sin. So in a way, the Waitaha land was split in half. I'm using broad terms here for simplicity's sake. Half of it became confiscated land. The other half, through the land court, was actually acknowledged as being Waitaha land. And it was under the signatory of Hakaraia, old Hakaraia's son, Hakaraia Tipene. So after the land wars here, after the Te Weranga, the wars up in the mountains, there was a scattering. People scattered everywhere. And what was left were people coming and going and sitting on this piece of land, this 25,000 acres of land that was deemed to be the residual estate of Waitaha. So you can see, again using broad terms, from 1860, Waitaha was in control of maybe 70,000 acres. That was under their control by a series of circumstances, including the raupatu, including the land courts, including the incursions of other hapu making claims in here. By the early 1900s, they were left with 1,000 acres. Hence the term manueka, mano, 1,000 acres, 1,000 acres. Ko Waitaha te iwi he tangata ngā kaurua. It's a whakatauki that's been used for Waitaha, and in end result, it's decimation, it's scattering. That's the outcome of this loss. Another person then emerges into our story. George Vasey Stewart an extraordinary entrepreneur born in England who spent most of his time in Ireland. He ultimately was responsible for bringing about 4,000 immigrants to New Zealand and ended up being one of the main proponents for immigration into Te Puke area. That was his third incursion in terms of the immigration adventure. Katikati was his main place, and as many of you will know, Te Puke was where he ended up. He negotiated with the Crown, and that 25,000 acres that I talked about before was ultimately transferred to the Crown, and then it was sold to George Vesey Stewart on the condition that he settled this place here in a community-based way. So he was to establish actually a township. One of the little-known things is that the two Crown agents who negotiate that land transfer between Crown and Māori were ultimately put on trial for corruption. The practices that they engaged in that process was of high enough order that they were put on trial. Actually, the trial was ultimately dismissed, but one of the chief lawyers at the time says he has no idea how these people escaped from being found guilty. That's just to give some background into the complexity of what was happening in terms of how this 25,000 acres ended up in Crown lands. So he brings these immigrants from England on the Lady Jocelyn, comes into Tauranga Moana, and he signs an agreement for the Te Puke block. That was to have several things, as you can see on there, set aside, native reserves. They were to have different village reserves, and these were kind of like your idealised community. And that's what the Te Puke settlement was to be. Percy Smith, the well-known ethnographer and surveyor, said, "I consider that Te Puke affords one of the best sites for settlement now available in the Bay of Plenty." So the plan was drawn up, and so here's our hypothetical plan from Te Puke. And there were school sites that were designated, there were church sites that were designated, there were parks that were designated. Yeah, churches were essential to the early settlement. You had to have them. They were set aside. And the Te Puke school first opened on 1883. I don't know why that's doing that, sorry. And in 1883, the primary school was established. And there you may recognise some of the names of the first pupils. 22 pupils were enrolled in that primary school. And the high school was established on the same site, actually, of the primary school with 41 pupils. And again, if you might recognise, there's some well-known names on that original roll there of Te Puke High School. This Vesey community flourished. The town that we know it, in its ups and downs, has essentially flourished. Hoi. My view. The impact upon Te Ao Māori over that last 100-odd years has resulted in deep mamai, deep loss of land, which is a loss of mana. It also is a loss of the economic base, loss of language, loss of culture, and I think probably most challenging to identity was the role of the government which said our job is to ease the dying pillow of Māori. That was the Crown motivation through those 100 years in terms of bringing Māori into a European context, which was deemed to be for their good, for sure. Not necessarily a Machiavellian kind of overruling, but a patronising, you might say, perhaps patriarchal indeed, view that Te iwi Māori is best served if they actually become absorbed into our lifestyle and into our identity. So I'm finishing now. In 2013, after negotiations with the Crown, this is the apology that the Crown makes to the descendants of Hei and Waitaha. The Crown is deeply sorry that it has failed to fulfil its obligations to Waitaha under the Treaty of Waitangi. The Crown's acts and omissions have severed you from almost all of your traditional lands and driven your ancient iwi to the point where it nearly ceased to exist. For these acts and the omissions, and for the suffering they caused and continue to cause, the Crown apologises. The Tauranga confiscation was unjust and Hakaraia Mahika opposed it. For this, the Crown labelled him a rebel. In seeking to punish him, the Crown destroyed your houses, crops and livestock and ultimately took his life. The Crown inflicted further punishment even after his death by unfairly withholding a large amount of land from you. For these misdeeds, the Crown apologises to Waitaha and to Hakaraia. The stigma of rebellion has diminished the mana of Waitaha and forced deep divisions among you and between you and your neighbours. The Crown recognises that this burden has pressed most heavily on the descendants of Hakaraia, but has affected all of Waitaha. The Crown regrets that you have been forced to bear this stigma and wishes the mana and reputation of Hakaraia and Waitaha to be restored. Accordingly, the Crown apologises for the part it played in placing this burden upon you. The Crown wishes to restore its own tarnished honour too, and hopes that this apology will mark the beginning of a stronger relationship with Waitaha, a relationship based on trust, cooperation and respect for the Treaty of Waitangi. Accordingly, the Crown echoes the following Waitaha whakatauki. Ko Toitū rangi Māori ke te whare o Hakaraia, ake, ake, ake. The peace has been settled in the house of Hakaraia now and forevermore. So, I began by saying, reconciling our stories. Regardless of how we view the past and regardless of our interpretation of the past, many complex stories from this whenua, from this land, reverberate amongst us right now. And I feel it behoves us to grapple with this. And we may have different opinions, but it behoves us, as our society moves forward, to come to the table together, to talk and to grapple with some of these things. Ka mutu anai nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.